Welcome to 15-Minute History with your host, Nicky Casseb. Today we are going to be discussing the former German city of Konigsberg in East Prussia, now known today as Kaliningrad, the capital of the Kaliningrad Oblast in Russia. The city of Konigsberg has a long history beginning in 1255 when the area around it was conquered by the Teutonic Order, who began construction of a fortress in the new settlement. The new city soon became an important port, joining the Hanseatic League in 1340. The city, though established in the territory of the Old Prussians, who were indigenous Baltic peoples, became the capital of the Duchy of Prussia in 1525, when the 37th Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Albert, converted to Lutheranism and secularized the order, thus establishing the new duchy. Albert was a member of the House of Hohenzollern, whose family would continue to rule Prussia until 1918. The city continued to be the capital or co-capital of Prussia until 1701, when Frederick I established the Kingdom of Prussia, with Berlin being the sole capital, thus reducing the economic and political importance of Konigsberg. The city also had its first taste of Russian occupation from 1758 to 1763, when Eastern Prussia was occupied during the 7 Years' War. The city regained some importance in 1772, when it became the capital of East Prussia. It was once again the home of the Prussian court during the Napoleonic Wars. For a city with such a long history, and nearly 650 years under its belt by 1900, the 20th century would bring about many more changes. The city started the century off with a population of 188,000, by far the largest city of East Prussia, which is mainly an agricultural province. This is a significant increase from the 173,000 citizens in 1890 and 141,000 in 1880, showing the city was enjoying a significant population growth. As with much of northern Germany, with the exception of Polish majority areas, the city was primarily Protestant, with most of those being Lutherans. The city, as it had been for hundreds of years, continued to be an important military station, as it was one of the closest major cities to the Russian frontier. As such, extensive fortifications were built in the city, and a garrison of 9,000 men were permanently stationed there at the start of the century. Despite the general decline of the economic situation in eastern Germany, partially as a result of the industrialization of the West, Konigsberg didn't fall too far behind. The city was connected to major cities in both Germany and Russia via railways by the 1860s, and an electric tramway was running through the city by the 1900s. With the German naval buildup, there was even a class of light cruisers named after the city, beginning in 1905. The city continued to grow despite this economic decline, reaching around 250,000 people in 1914, just prior to the beginning of World War I. Speaking of World War I, the city had an important role in the war, especially towards the beginning. The war began July 28, 1914, and by August 7th, Russian troops were beginning an invasion of East Prussia, which Konigsberg was the capital and the largest city of. As one can imagine, this certainly wasn't ideal. It was also fairly unexpected, as the German general staff didn't believe that Russia would be able to mobilize as fast as it did. With two Russian armies entering the province, the Russian First Army and Second Army, possessing a combined 650,000 to 800,000 troops, the situation in East Prussia appeared pretty dire. The Germans, on the other hand, only had one army in the region, the German Eighth Army, which was led by Maximilian von Pritzwitz. This army was significantly smaller than that of the Russians as well, estimated at between 135,000 and 250,000 troops. An outside observer might think that the invasion would be a massive success for the Russians. This, however, proved to be far from true. While the Russians were certainly able to mobilize faster than the Germans expected, their forces were shamefully unprepared and rushed. The Russian troops were untrained, overly spread out, and had virtually no transportation apparatus. The first battle of the East Prussian campaign was the Battle of Stadler-Ponen, about 90 miles away from Konigsberg. While this was a rather minor battle, it was nevertheless an impressive German victory. One infantry division, led by General Hermann von Francois, was able to rout 4 infantry divisions led by Russian General Paul von Rennenkampf, who, despite his German name, was a loyal Russian. General Francois feeling rather confident after his victory against the Russians, convinced commanding General Pritzwitz to lead an attack on the enemy forces, the Battle of Gumbinnen. This proved to be a big mistake, as Pritzwitz was far too incapable of leading such an attack. After facing Russian artillery and seeing German troops retreating from battle, Pritzwitz decided to have his army withdraw entirely from East Prussia. The German general staff, led by von Moltke, was quite upset with this decision. Moltke had previously forbidden any German offensives in the region and was especially concerned about the morale loss that would come with abandoning East Prussia. Moltke replaced Pritzwitz with Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. These two managed to get things under control rather quickly, and within just a few days of Pritzwitz's defeat, they are ready for another battle with the Russians. This battle, the famed Battle of Tannenberg, proved to be a massive success for the Germans. It was an impressive morale boost to German troops as well, especially as it was considered vengeance for the German defeat in the legendary Battle of Grunwald 500 years prior. Hindenburg became a national hero, and Ludendorff was also recognized for his role in the battle. On the Russian side, however, the commanding general, Alexander Samsonov, committed suicide, unable to face the shame of his disastrous defeat. Tannenberg, however, was not the end of the Russian invasion. The end of the invasion came a few weeks later in September, with the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, also led by Hindenburg. The Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes in February 1915 removed all the Russian troops from East Prussia, putting Russia on the defensive against Germany for the rest of the war. East Prussia and Konigsberg were now safe from invasion. The city, as with the rest of the nation, suffered significantly as the war went on due to malnutrition from the food crisis and other scarcities. Despite a German victory in the Eastern Front of World War I, signing a peace agreement with Russia in March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, things changed after the signing of the November armistice with the Western powers. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, in addition to reparations, military restrictions, and the loss of its colonial empire, the new German government, the Weimar Republic, was forced to give up large tracts of territory in eastern Germany to Poland, Lithuania, and Czechoslovakia. This included most of the provinces of West Prussia and Posen. There was even an attempt to separate East Prussia from Germany, but a 1920 plebiscite determined that over 95% of voters wished to remain as part of Germany. This even included Poles. As a result of these territorial changes that created the Polish corridor, Konigsberg and the rest of its province were now an exclave from the rest of the country. Railway travel became quite difficult due to Polish restrictions, and maritime connections were the main form of staying connected with the rest of the nation. As one can imagine, being divided from the rest of the nation didn't sit too well with the people of East Prussia. Being quite upset, they chose to vote for the party which generally represented those unhappy with the status quo. In the last free and fair election of the Weimar Republic, the November 1932 election, the Nazi Party won 39.7% of the vote, more than the national average of 33%. In the March 1933 election, the Nazis further increased their vote share in East Prussia to over 55%, a large increase from 1932, and again well above the national average of 44%. This election, however, was heavily tainted by massive voter repression, terror, and propaganda. The city of Konigsberg had a population of 3,200 Jews in 1933, but with Nazi persecution, this number had dropped to around 1,500, as estimated after Kristallnacht. The new synagogue of Konigsberg, the main house of worship for Jewish citizens, was also destroyed during Kristallnacht, not to be rebuilt for many years. In May 1939, just prior to the beginning of World War II, the population of Konigsberg was around 375,000 people, with the province of East Prussia having around 2.5 million inhabitants. With the many early Nazi successes in World War II, the city and population, at least if you were a German, of Konigsberg didn't experience many effects of the war until mid-1944. Things ended up not being too pretty for the minorities of the city. The remaining Jews in the city were sent to concentration camps, while many Polish inhabitants became slave laborers, with 15,000 working within the city itself. The city faced several Soviet airstrikes between 1941 and 1943, causing some damage to the city. The real damage, however, came in August 1944 with British airstrikes. The Royal Air Force dropped hundreds of tons of bombs throughout the city, destroying nearly the entire historic city center, the famed castle, cathedral, university, as well as 40% of the city's housing and 20% of its industry was destroyed in these attacks. Similar to the bombing at Dresden, these RAF air attacks were also questionable, as Konigsberg was particularly lacking in strategic targets. From here, things only got worse. The Red Army began its invasion into mainland Germany, being only temporarily halted by successful German resistance in the Gumbinnen operation. With the Red Army's approach into East Prussia came many atrocities. One of the first of these against ethnic Germans was the Nemmersdorf massacre in East Prussia. As fear grew amongst the populace of future massacres, so began the evacuation of East Prussia in January 1945. Civilians and military fled from the ruined province over the next several months by land and sea. Operation Hannibal, ordered by Admiral Karl Donitz, rescued between 800,000 and 900,000 civilians by sea. Others fled by means of wagon carts and horses, making this seem much more like the pre-industrial 1800s than 1945. While there are many different estimates, of around 2.6 million people in the province, 2 million evacuated. Konigsberg was left with only around 20% of its population by May 1945. As the civilians fled, German troops continued to fight on against the Soviets. Konigsberg became besieged in January, and German troops managed to hold on to the city for nearly 3 months until a final Soviet assault conquered the city on April 9th. The city was almost completely destroyed in the siege, with 80 to 90% of it in ruins. Even with the end of the war in May, things didn't get too much better for those in Konigsberg. The remaining civilian population was forced by the Soviets into slave labor and died by the thousands of disease, starvation, and straight-up murder. By the time the Soviets decided they were finally done abusing the population in 1949, only 20,000 people still remained, who were then expelled from the area. At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, it was decided that the Soviets would get to annex East Prussia, including Konigsberg. With this came the end of Konigsberg as it was known for 700 years. The city was renamed Kaliningrad after Mikhail Kalinin in 1946, and Russian settlers soon came pouring in. The city, in ruins after World War II, was mostly rebuilt over the years, but no longer following the Prussian design. Instead, the city was designed to be a little Moscow and filled with modernist housing projects and rows of Khrushchevka apartments. While partially ruined, but certainly restorable, German-era buildings were generally demolished. Even the remains of the Konigsberg Castle were demolished on the order of Leonid Brezhnev in 1968. Being the westernmost province of the Soviet Union, the city was especially important in the Cold War, both militarily and economically, as a yearly ice-free port. With the Perestroika movement and the collapse of the Soviet Union, things had become a little better for the German legacy in the city. The Konigsberg Cathedral, the resting place of Immanuel Kant, was rebuilt in the 1990s after having been heavily damaged by the RAF airstrikes. The new synagogue, destroyed during Kristallnacht, is also being rebuilt currently. Finally, there's even been some talk of rebuilding the monumental Konigsberg Castle. In regards to population, the city has around 400,000 people, primarily Russian. There are also around 1,700 Germans, making up less than half of 1% of the population. Interestingly enough, one of the tastiest dishes of the East Prussian era is still offered in the city, known as Konigsberger Klopes, which are veal meatballs served in white sauce. What is pretty clear, though, is that even though Konigsberg is long dead, some legacy, however small, still survives in Kaliningrad. Thank you for joining me for a 15-minute history lesson on the city of Konigsberg. Join me next week to learn about the history of police dogs.